From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu, in for David Weston. New data out this morning showing a rise in job openings in December and a decline in the number of people quitting. Is it progress? We go now to Austan Goolsbee, professor of economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, former chair, of course, as well, of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama administration. Austan, it's great to have you as we tick through the data this week, coming off the worst month for Wall Street since March 2020. It feels like each report carries a little bit of extra weight. ADP tomorrow, we have the big granddaddy report, the jobs report on Friday, and the White House has been out early. They spoke to us yesterday, Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, to try to get ahead of what's expected to be a very difficult number. How much of a slowdown, Austan Goolsbee, are you preparing for in the first part of this year?
Well, from the beginning of this thing, I have been of the view that the virus is the boss and drives the economy. And we had a lot of people out sick, to say nothing about the fear and the pullback. So I'm expecting a pretty bad number. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it was literally a negative number for the month, because anybody who still has their job but is not going to work counts as not. The survey asks you, were you at work last week?
Right.
So they would count as not at work. So I think it could be bad.
And that timing, the timing of the survey coincided with the peak of Omicron. So how about we look past this next report immediately? What is your expectation for job growth through the year? Is this going to be better in the second half?
I think it'll be better in the second half. We're still in this rebound phase. We still got about 3 million plus people, jobs that disappeared that are coming back. Mm-hmm. We don't know if some of those industries, they might never come back, and then they got to find new jobs. But we had very strong job growth last year overall. And I still think that on the back half of this year and going into the summer, with the economy growing as fast as it's been growing, we're probably going to continue to see pretty strong job growth. And hopefully we could get control of the supply chain and see at least the incremental inflation come back down to something like normal.
Which brings us to the Fed, of course. Wall Street banks are all trying to call the ball on this, Austan. I'm sure you see the same reports that we do here at Bloomberg. Goldman is now looking for 5 hikes, up from 4. Bank of America today is calling for 7 rate hikes this year. Bloomberg spoke with Patrick Harker, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, a little while ago, favors 4 quarter-point hikes. Let's listen to Harker.
We're probably going to have a bad jobs report in the end of this week. I mean, just because of Omicron. I think with respect to employment and with respect to inflation, we are there at our dual mandate, and that's why we need to act.
Austan, what's your call then for rate hikes this year? How many do we need? How many do you expect?
Well, I mean, I'll just go back to, you cannot answer that question until you know what is going to happen with the virus. Yeah. I wish people would stop getting so confident that we're past the virus. If we were, then we can afford a lot of rate increases because we can go back to something like normal. But if we get another variant, like what happened with Delta, like what happened with Omicron, and you add on top of that we're having this fiscal cliff and runoff of the stimulus money that we spent last year, so that turns into a real headwind. I think people should just be a little careful making these projections of 5, 6, 7 rate increases for the year. We got to be well past COVID for the economy to be able to handle that.
Well, it's getting to be kind of a parlor game. You know how that goes. But you're underscoring uncertainty, Austan Goolsbee. Do you worry that the Fed could overshoot here and drive the economy into recession?
Yeah, Joe, I do worry. They should at least be data dependent, and I think they are, and they're looking at the data. We should be sobered by the fact that a year ago, we were all very confident that COVID was going to be gone, and we had two surges with variants in the interim that were not expected and set us back.
Yeah.
And if you think that a lot of this inflation is coming from a negative supply shock, let's just remember the lesson of the 70s that tightening into the face of a supply shock is not going to solve your problem. So the Fed's view is very Fed-centric, like it's theirs to decide what the inflation rate is. And I just think the virus is the boss here. So the Fed needs to keep an eye on the data, definitely not pre-commit to 5, 6, 7 rate increases before they see whether the economy can handle it.
You know, the Biden administration told us for the better part of last year that Build Back Better, the soft infrastructure bill that the president put forward, would be the best way to help control rising prices from a legislative standpoint. It, of course, did not pass. Is the administration out of tools now to control inflation? Simply defer to the Fed?
A little bit. I mean, I wasn't a fan of analyzing Build Back Better as for its impact on inflation. There were some people who said they thought it would increase inflation.
Yes.
The administration said they thought it could decrease inflation. Most all of the money of Build Back Better would not go out the door for multiple years in the future, so it kind of wasn't relevant to short-run inflation. I think all inflation is mostly determined by the private sector, and I think a lot of it has to do with the supply chain. The fact that PPI inflation, not CPI, but the business-to-business transactions inflation is up double digits in Europe, in China, in the U.S., is telling you that there's a major supply disruption going on. And if we can get control of that, then I think inflation can come down. But all of that is not under the control of the government.
Sure.
And it's not under the control of the Fed either.
Well, you've got USICA, though. You have the Innovation and Competition Bill, Austan, that the administration says we need to pass to solve the chip shortage, a key problem in the supply chain bottleneck here. If that doesn't pass, do we just wait around for this to resolve itself?
Yeah, kind of. The part of the thing about shortages and supply constraints is that it is precisely the price signal that the market is giving that prices are high induces more supply. So the administration should be doing everything they can to partly address the kind of regulatory and ports and stuff on the supply chain, but really everything they can to encourage investment and production. It's the one hole in the recovery is that business investment has not been high enough. So if the Fed goes raising the interest rates and it leads to less business investment so that the supply side doesn't expand as fast as we need it to, there can be a downside.
Austan Goolsbee of the Chicago Booth School, thank you for your time today on
Great
Bloomberg. We have a lot to pick through there, and we want to get reaction now from our panel today. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern in Washington, along with Emily Wilkins. It's great to have both of you here. Annmarie, you heard Austan Goolsbee describing the possibility, predicting possibly a negative number on Friday with this jobs report. You know well, the Biden administration's trying to get its arms around this data right now. January was a tough month. We could have some really difficult numbers this week. How damaging politically would it be to have a negative read on jobs at this point?
Well, hearing Brian Deese this morning on MSNBC, it's obvious the administration is trying to get the American people behind this and the fact that they are signposting that it doesn't look like January is going to be a good jobs number. And, you know, Joe, if you just take a look at EcoGo, you could see the low estimate from a number of analysts, negative 400,000, high being 250,000. So it does look like the street is also matching up potentially the White House is feeling due to Omicron. I think it's going to be tough for the administration because they are dealing with high inflation numbers. And this is really the political cloud that is overshadowing them, whether or not you talk to individuals at the White House or individuals on the Hill. And what they push to the administration is that, yes, we have high inflation, but look how good we're doing in the labor market, especially the 3.9% unemployment rate. So tomorrow they're going to have to recalibrate how they're going to try to sell this to the American people. Well,
I'll tell you, Emily, I asked Austan Goolsbee about the Innovation and Competition Act. It's something that you've done some great reporting on. I want to ask you specifically about a letter that was written, something that I saw on your Twitter feed. Representative Judy Chu of California chairs the Asian Pacific American Caucus. issuing a warning in the form of a letter to her colleagues to be careful how they talk about this bill aimed at competing with China, of course, because of concerns about hate crimes against the Asian community. How real are those concerns?
So if you look at data on hate crimes against Asian Americans, they have really spiked since the start of the coronavirus. A lot of people sort of associating the coronavirus with China and then taking that against Asian American individuals. And you've seen this across the country. It's really become sort of a big concern and to a certain extent a bipartisan concern. So what the chairwoman asked of her colleagues is to make sure that when they are criticizing China, that they do so specifically about China's government, not necessarily Chinese citizens who might not have the ability to make some decisions on say, what happens with the Uyghurs or what happens with China foreign policy. But this is a debate we're going to see start right around this afternoon. We are expecting a vote on the bill in the House, potentially as early as tomorrow, could be a little later in the week. We're expecting a party line vote, mostly Democrat support. From there, it's going to be going to a conference between a House bill and a Senate bill. And the goal, they have to find a bipartisan way forward here because this isn't something they can move through that Democrat-only reconciliation process.
A lot to talk about with Annmarie Hordern and Emily Wilkins, who are going to be with us for the hour, and we'll check back with them a little bit later on. Coming up, Virginia Senator Mark Warner will be joining us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu for Bloomberg First Word News. Now we go to Mark Crumpton.
Joe, thank you. Today in Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin says the United States and its NATO allies have ignored Russia's main security concerns as tensions escalate over Ukraine. He spoke at the Kremlin during a joint news conference with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. In Washington, senators are negotiating a sanctions package to deter a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Lawmakers are optimistic they'll resolve lingering disagreements and strike a deal this week. The sanctions would include targeting Russian elites and oligarchs with close ties to President Putin. In pro football, it's now official. Tom Brady is retiring. The Tampa Bay quarterback is stepping away from the game after 22 seasons. Brady won 7 Super Bowls, 6 of them with the New England Patriots. 5 times he was the game's most valuable player. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Joe?
Mark, thank you. We go now to Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. He's chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and we have a lot to talk about. Senator, thank you for being with us on Balance of Power. I'd like to start with you on the standoff with Russia and Ukraine, with some fresh commentary now from Vladimir Putin, who says the U.S. and NATO ignored Russia's key concerns. We know Russia's accusing the U.S. of whipping up hysteria, I believe was the phrase before the UN Security Council. As chair of the Intelligence Committee, how do you interpret what you're seeing? Vladimir Putin continuing to build up troops on the border.
Well, clearly, it is Russia aggression now. 100,000 plus troops, a daily drumbeat of additional troops, supplies. You know, these troops not only in eastern Ukraine, in Russia, but now in Belarus as well. And ironically, the Ukrainians have had some of these requests, like the request to join NATO, in their constitution, I believe, since 2015, 2016. So there's nothing new about Ukrainian aspirations.
Sure.
But the Ukrainians themselves would acknowledge that would take a long time and a number of other hurdles to go through. So there's a bit of disingenuousness coming from the Russian leader. I actually think the next few weeks are going to be some of the most challenging. I don't know whether Mr. Putin will move during the Olympics. And clearly, if you get into March too late, the ground gets softer and the ability for Russian tanks to go move forward will be delayed. So we're in that key period. And this is, I think, one of the things that has thrown Putin a little bit off stride. And this I give the administration, my critique of the administration at different points, but this is where I give the Biden White House high marks in terms of rallying NATO. The NATO that we had a year ago was in pretty bad shape after 4 years of abuse from Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He's had to rebuild part of these alliances. And frankly, the Brits have been on board with us from early on, but frankly convince a number of the other NATO nations of the seriousness of this threat, and occasionally convincing the Ukrainian government itself the seriousness of this threat. And I think it's been slow, methodical. And what we've seen the last couple weeks is literally a diplomatic flooding of the zone. There's not a day that goes by. Prime Minister Johnson's in Kyiv today. We've got the American Secretary of State dealing with the Russian foreign minister on a daily basis. And two things I just mentioned that have been a little bit unprecedented. When it appeared that the Russians might use a false flag operation to destabilize the Iranian government, the American government leaned forward and said, if something happens like a coup, this is Russia. And then the British government even leaned more forward and said, even identifying certain people, that if they suddenly became the president of Ukraine, that would be Russian action.
Right.
That's never happened before at this kind of coordinated level.
Senator, President Biden says the U.S. is ready for anything. He spoke to reporters briefly in the Oval Office yesterday. Let's listen to what he said.
But with Russia continuing its buildup of its forces around Ukraine, we are ready no matter what happens.
No matter what happens, the four words that stuck out to me, Senator, how do you interpret that language? And I'll ask you directly, are we moving closer to or further from war?
I think we are ratcheting up the pressure on Vladimir Putin, who frankly does not get a lot of outside input, who I think believed a few months back that if Russia went in, the West would not do much, and frankly that the Ukrainians might even greet the Russians as liberators. I think he's been disabused of both the West stance and the pushback from the Ukrainians themselves. So I think we're going to keep ratcheting up that pressure. Again, I think the next few weeks are going to be absolutely critical. And I think Putin is starting to realize the downside on this in terms of not only economic sanctions, but potentially Russia being, the oligarchs that support Russia being hurt in the pocketbooks at a level that has been unprecedented, I hope is giving him pause. And candidly, even if they were going to Ukraine, you've got a population there that has, by all indications, going to resist, even if their government were to fall.
Well, Senator, I'd like to ask you about your work on the banking committee. Quickly, though, I want to ask you about sanctions, because I know you're involved in this and have been for quite some time, for weeks and months, in terms of the Menendez-Risch bill right now. Would you support initial sanctions being implemented immediately and holding more for later if there's an invasion?
Well, I think we definitely need the strongest sanctions ever should Russia invade. I think we're getting close, though, when we're talking about this very short timeline. The sanctions pre-invasion, I worry a bit, may push Putin into saying, well, what do I got to lose? They've already sanctioned me. So I think this is a very delicate time right now. If we put some of those pre-sanctions in a few months ago, maybe better, but now we're at a very, very delicate point. And one thing I would also urge, Bloomberg, I love the business audience, the ramifications of some of these actions, if Russia not only thinks about a military, but a major cyber attack, most businesses in the world remember the NotPetya attack of 5 or 6 years ago and the ramifications it had around supply chain networks all over the world. I would urge every business to go back and redouble their cyber defense over the next few weeks as well, because this could be a not only a traditional challenge in terms of a invasion, but could have huge cyber implications.
You've got work to do this week on the Banking Committee confirmation hearings for the 3 nominees that President Biden has put forth for those open seats on the Federal Reserve. Do you support all 3 of them?
Well, I'm going to meet with them. I believe we start those meetings later today. I know them all by reputation and think their bona fides, their qualifications, they've met those bars. I've got questions, just as I will have questions for any Fed nominee. And once I get a chance to meet with them and then get a chance to see them at the hearing, I'll be weighing in more. But in terms of qualifications of all 3 of the individuals, I think they're top notch.
Some of your Republican colleagues, along with the Chamber of Commerce, other groups, the oil and gas lobby, are questioning Sarah Bloom Raskin's approach to climate as a financial risk. Is that something you worry about? And when you meet with her, I'm assuming that's today, Senator, are you going to warn her about a tough hearing?
I think it's also interesting that, if we think about the banking industry, who have been generally supportive of Ms. Raskin. They know she's progressive, but they've worked with her in previous roles. I know even my local bankers in Virginia are at least net neutral to slightly positive. And I think anyone that doesn't acknowledge the potential climate risk to our economy is not very connected to the reality of the world we live in 2022.
Do any other Democrats have concerns like that, Senator? Will any Democrats vote against these nominees?
Again, predicting Democrats or Republicans, for that matter, on what their voting pattern will be is a tough haul. I think the idea that climate has effect on our economy on a regular basis, and we need to, in a sense, assess some of those costs on a systemic risk basis, actually is the prudent thing to do.
Senator Mark Warner from the Commonwealth of Virginia, we thank you for being with us today on Bloomberg. Coming up, massive profits reported by ExxonMobil this morning. We'll check on the markets straight ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Earnings season continues.
Not since the 1980s have we seen these sorts of reversals.
Bloomberg is fastest with the numbers and analysis.
The fundamental story is really solid.
It's really kind of a balancing act.
Bloomberg, the fastest numbers and analysis you trust.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu. ExxonMobil posting the biggest profit in almost 8 years this morning as the earning parade continues. Let's get more right now from Kriti Gupta. Pretty interesting here to see ExxonMobil benefiting from a story we talk about a heck of a lot on this broadcast, rising oil and gas prices.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only have they really benefited from that, and that's something you're seeing across energy companies, they're actually boosting some of their investments in those new oil wells. Let's put that into comparison with what we saw from Chevron just last week, the idea that some of those longer aged wells actually ate into the profits of their bottom line. So you're really seeing Exxon get out in front of it. You also are seeing Exxon's free cash flow triple from 2020. So once again, speaking to the idea that they're really benefiting from those energy prices.
UPS also with a big report. Another story we talk about, endless demand for shipping.
Endless demand for shipping. They hiked up their rates, which is actually really helping their bottom line. But I think the biggest UPS story, which we know is kind of this economic bellwether, is that they actually got in front of the labor issue way before not only their peers, but the rest of corporate America, way ahead of the holidays. They said, not only are we going to start hiring workers early, we're going to do it at a higher wage too. So by the time those kind of inventory issues and supply chain issues showed up for other customers, UPS was already ahead of it. And you can really see how that affected their bottom line. And just to really highlight the effect this is having on the market, the two biggest index contributors right now are UPS and Exxon.
Wow, big move. Thank you so much, Kriti Gupta. Coming up, COVID hospitalizations are dropping nationwide. Have we peaked? We'll check in with a doctor fighting the pandemic on the front lines. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu for Bloomberg First Word News. Now let's go to Mark Crumpton. Mark?
Joe, thank you. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken talked on the phone with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov today. The State Department says Secretary Blinken reiterated the U.S. commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He also urged immediate Russian de-escalation and the withdrawal of troops and equipment. President Putin has repeatedly denied plans to invade while amassing some 100,000 troops near Ukraine's borders. New research shows pregnant women with COVID-19 rarely transmit the virus to their newborns. Scientists say that's because COVID isn't often found in a patient's bloodstream. But pregnant women with COVID can still be at risk for serious illness, which can also have negative health consequences for her newborn. Recent studies have linked COVID-19 infection during pregnancy to both preterm labor and stillbirth. In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott faces a crucial test of whether he and Republican lawmakers have done enough to shore up the power grid, and it comes weeks before his party's primary vote. Temperatures are expected to plummet tomorrow with sleet and snow in some parts of the state. Almost a year ago, a storm forced power plants in Texas offline and left millions in the state without heat for days. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Joe?
Mark, thank you. Signs of improvement on the pandemic front. It's nice to say. U.S. hospital admissions falling in 34 states and the nation's capital from the prior week. This despite rising concerns surrounding a new version of the Omicron variant, a subvariant with early data showing it could be more contagious than the original. For more, we bring in Dr. Michelle Della Piazza, Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School Associate Professor of Medicine. Dr. Della Piazza, thank you for being with us. I want to start by asking you about vaccinations for young kids. We have an important headline today from Pfizer, a delicate and important conversation, I realize, but Pfizer's vaccine could be ready for kids under 5, the Washington Post reports, potentially by the end of February. If that happens, will you recommend that parents get shots into their youngest?
Yes, absolutely. I will recommend that. This is really exciting news for us, especially those who have young children at home who have not yet been eligible for vaccination.
Yeah.
So Pfizer is going to be seeking the emergency use authorization to vaccinate children between the ages of 6 months and 5 years. Up to 5 years who previously were ineligible for the vaccine. And this is based on some preliminary data that show that there is a robust response to the vaccine, particularly in children 6 months to 2 years. And while Pfizer is doing additional studies to look to see if additional doses for children 2 to 5 might actually improve their immune response, they've decided to seek this in order to get these children protected as much as possible.
What kind of side effects does a 6-month-old possibly have, doctor? Do we know enough to answer that?
We don't know enough to answer that yet based on the clinical studies, but the FDA is going to be reviewing that very closely. What we do know from press releases is that adverse reactions and side effects were very rare, and serious adverse effects were very rare as well. And so they are going to be seeking this approval and knowing that it is a very safe and effective vaccine.
Well, this is an important conversation we're having. I don't have to tell you how many concerns so many parents have when it comes to vaccinating children. Why do people see it differently than they do for vaccinating themselves? Frequently, these are parents who were first in line to get a shot, but they're worried about their kids.
Right. Well, I think that's because the studies have been later, right? Now we have so much data about adults and vaccination from all over the world. Now that, millions of people have been vaccinated and the first vaccines rolled out over a year ago. So we have both numbers and duration to know that these are very safe vaccines. When it comes to children, you're making a decision not for yourself, but for someone else. And I think that understandably, a lot of parents have some concerns about making decisions for their young ones. And there's less data to really be able to make these decisions. At the same time, what I always try to think about in weighing this decision as my patients are thinking about getting vaccines for themselves or for their family members is, well, what is the risk of getting COVID? And we know that the risk of getting COVID is far greater than the risk of the vaccine.
I mentioned earlier, hospital admissions are down 34 states in D.C., more than half the country. Has Omicron peaked?
So it appears that that's occurring. Even thinking about our own hospital here in Newark, New Jersey, at University Hospital, at the peak in early January, we had over 160 admissions with COVID. And now that's down to less than 40. So we are definitely seeing a decline in COVID admissions. There is, of course, the concern for the new BA2 version of Omicron, because in Denmark, that seems to be prolonging the Omicron wave that they're having there. So we are keeping an eye out for that as well.
How about demographically? You specialize in socioeconomic portion of this. Different segments of the community are impacted by COVID in different ways. Omicron may not be peaking for certain individuals. Doctor, who are they?
Right. So we did a study that looked at data back in 2020, early in the COVID first surge that we had, that showed that those people who were adversely affected by social determinants of health, things like discrimination in housing, in income, in education, that they were at greater risk for developing complications of COVID. And a lot of this is really driven by structural inequity, things like structural racism that drive discrimination and all of these different socioeconomic factors.
Is it economic? Is it the ability to afford masks, treatment, and so forth, or is it access to information?
I think it is on multiple levels. What we know is that, structural factors that limit your opportunity to wellness, because we know things like income and access to green space and healthy spaces really help people live and thrive very healthfully. And when that access is limited by structural barriers, then people often live with chronic illness that results from those adverse social, economic factors. At the same time, we also know that discrimination has a direct effect on an individual's health in the form of chronic stress that accumulates over time and leads to chronic illness. And chronic illness, of course, is a risk factor for severe COVID. And then lastly, there's the healthcare system itself, which has a lot of bias ingrained into it, particularly for racial and ethnic minorities and other historically marginalized groups. And so as a result, oftentimes the type of care or the treatment that someone might get would be very inequitable based on those factors.
It's a part of the conversation we're probably not having enough. We thank Dr. Michelle Dalla Piazza of Rutgers University. Coming up, the governor of Alaska, Mike Dunleavy, with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We have a chance to sort of restate and reassert our world leadership on a whole range of issues. We are doing better than any nation, any major nation in the world. We got to keep that, we got to pick it up. And I can think of no better group of people to pick it up with.
President Joe Biden speaking at the National Governors Association meeting, voicing support for state leaders across the U.S. Public health, infrastructure, education, all on the agenda. And we go now to the governor of Alaska, Mike Dunleavy. Governor, it's great to have you here. I'd like to start by asking about something that we were chatting about a bit earlier this hour that is central to the economy in Alaska, and that's oil and gas. ExxonMobil putting up a very impressive, stronger than expected profit from the last quarter, of course, on the back of rising oil and gas prices. Highest profit since 2014. Why does the company deserve access to more drilling in Alaska, as you have called for, if they're doing so well now?
Well, it's not the company, it's the state of Alaska, and it's the country that need more access. David, we need as much energy as possible to secure our national security, so we're not dependent upon others. We need to be exploring and developing more oil for the jobs, for the wealth, for the revenue for states like mine. And what's not talked about very much in this whole shut down America, shut down Alaska with regard to oil and gas is, when it comes to the environment, many of these people that want to shut down Alaska are saying it's because of environmental concerns. Alaska probably has the strictest environmental regulations on the planet when it comes to oil and gas. And if you shut down Alaska, if you shut down America, and you send this exploration, this development overseas, you can almost assure that the environment will be wrecked in a manner that you would not have occur here in the United States and in Alaska. So no matter how you look at this, it's a win-win-win-win for America and Alaska to explore and produce oil here, and it's a lose-lose-lose. So it's less about the companies. I mean, that's great that they're making money, but it's more about the United States and Alaska.
And your state's economy. With that said, the Interior Department says it's blocking oil and gas leasing on 11 million acres of Alaska's North Slope. I know you disagree with that, Governor. I'm wondering what that means for jobs in your state.
It means no jobs. I have to tell you, under the Trump administration, every meeting I had with the president was about what can we do to help create opportunities in Alaska, whether it's the Tongass National Forest, whether it's a presidential permit to allow a railroad to come across the border with Canada, whether it was Annmarie, you named it, was all about opportunity. This is just the opposite. And to take these opportunities off the table for Alaska, where does that leave Alaska? Where do we create the jobs? Where do we create the wealth and the revenue in which our state is dependent upon? And keep in mind, this is very important. Alaska was the only state to become a state under the preconditions that we would develop our resources, because we were such a large state with a small population. That really was one of the few reasons we became a state, is we agreed to collectivize those resources under the government and produce resources. And now we're being told we can't do that.
One of the conversations at the Governors Association meeting, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, is inflation. It's something that you and governors around the country are dealing with. How badly is inflation impacting families in Alaska?
Well, it's interesting because your price of fuel is going up, which is good for Alaska's revenue, but we would rather produce more oil. We would rather have more barrels of oil going through the pipeline, keep that price at a certain level so that we don't have inflation going through the roof. But when it comes to travel, when it comes to heating your homes, producing electricity, the plastics and other materials that oil goes into, you couple that with the supply chain issues in which more and more shelves are becoming bare, the labor issues which are contributing to that, you got a mess on your hands. And the sooner we start looking forward and moving through the post-pandemic period, the sooner we realize that America's security really rests upon our energy security, the better off we're going to be.
You delivered your State of the State address last week. Governor spoke to a number of issues, including COVID. And I'll quote, "By any measure," you said, "history will reflect that our actions helped us achieve some of the best outcomes in the nation." Right now, Alaska has the highest per capita infection rate in the country, even with the smallest density in the U.S. Why are infections still that high in Alaska?
Because it's a highly contagious virus. This has happened throughout the country. It comes in waves. It will continue to do so. The real question is, how many deaths has Alaska had? We're second lowest in the nation after Vermont. What is the survivability rate, which no one talks about? If you were infected in the state of Alaska, your chances of surviving is 99.5%. We have the best survivability rate in the state of Alaska, in Alaska. And we've supported our hospitals with hundreds of workers to relieve our fatigued hospital workers. So we're actually doing pretty good when you look at those metrics.
You're joining Texas in court to stop the federal government from mandating vaccines for National Guard members. You see, it undermines your authority as commander-in-chief in the state. It also, you say, undermines readiness. How can a guardsman be ready, though, if they have COVID?
We're all going to get COVID, unfortunately.
Are we?
And those that are, I think we are. Those that are, I had it. Those that are vaccinated,
So did I.
many of those folks, many of those folks are going to get it. This is in animals. This is in 30-40% of all mammals. This is everywhere. It's just the way it is. We just have to recognize that for what it is. But moving National Guard folks out of the National Guard because they don't have a vaccination or out of the military, how does that help our readiness? And studies are coming out now in which it shows that natural immunity actually there's something to it, that it actually will protect you, hopefully, from future variants. But we're going to be going through this for some time until this virus finds its footing. We got to live with it. We got to work through it. And mandating mitigating approaches, it doesn't seem to be stopping the virus. The virus seems to be doing what it wants to do.
Are you talking to your counterparts in other states then to have other governors sign on to that lawsuit? What are you hearing?
Yeah, we're having conversations. And as you know, we've signed on to a number of different vaccine mandate lawsuits because we believe that individuals should be able to choose how they want to take care of their health. We've made vaccines readily available in the state of Alaska. We have therapeutics that are available. There will be more therapeutics. If people want to wear a mask, they should be allowed to wear a mask. If people don't want to wear a mask, they shouldn't have to be forced to wear a mask. But the mandates, no matter where you look on this planet, mandates and lockdowns aren't stopping this virus because it's so highly contagious. We just have to recognize that what we don't want to do is destroy society. We don't want to destroy our economies. And we're going to have to work through this.
I have to ask you lastly, Governor, the conversation that I'm sure you're overhearing in Washington about Russia, Ukraine. You're in a precarious part of the world as this debate is happening. What are you prepared for if Vladimir Putin decides to do the wrong thing?
Well, as you mentioned, we're on the front lines. We're only literally 2.5 miles from Russian territory, Alaska is. And we're keeping an eye on things. We've got a number of robust military bases, Air Force and Army in Alaska. So we're keeping an eye on things. We're in communication with the commanders of those bases. And so right now, we are, I wouldn't say we're not concerned, but again, we have to deal with Korean missile launches, which could hit Alaska. We have to deal with the Chinese coming up through the Bering Strait. We have to deal with the Russians almost on a daily basis. It's just the nature of being in Alaska. But we're keeping an eye on things. We're working with the commanders, and right now, we're doing what Alaska does, and that's moving forward and keeping an eye on our neighbors.
Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy, we thank you for the time today on Bloomberg.
Thanks.
Coming up, our panel, Emily Wilkins, Annmarie Hordern, back from Washington as we focus on reforming possibly the Electoral Count Act. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu. I want to reassemble our panel with Annmarie Hordern and Emily Wilkins from Washington as we turn now to reform of the Electoral Count Act stemming from the mayhem of January 6th. And to be clear, a different proposition than the voting rights legislation that apparently does not have the support, at least not now, to get through Congress. This is a more narrow approach to actually codify the role that the vice president plays in certifying the vote, bringing us back to Mike Pence a little more than a year ago here. Annmarie, we've got a bipartisan group of senators pursuing reform. We should hear from one of them. Susan Collins is in this group. She spoke about it on ABC this week. She's joining with Republicans and Democrats to try to get a bill here to reform the Electoral Count Act. Here she is.
I have brought together a group of 16 senators. It's a bipartisan group. Joe Manchin is involved on leading the Democratic side. And together we have been having discussions, Zoom meetings. We'll resume them tomorrow. And I'm hopeful that we can come up with a bipartisan bill that will make very clear that the vice president's role is simply ministerial, that he has no authority to halt the count.
Susan Collins, Republican from Maine, of course. Annmarie, Democrats didn't want to go down this road a couple of weeks ago. They thought it might distract from voting rights, but of course, that's not happening. Is it worth the time here, or is it a symbolic gesture that we're talking about to reform the Electoral Count Act?
Well, there's two things to keep in mind. One is that Senator Susan Collins, working with the likes of Joe Manchin and other Democrats, is actually only one group. Today, we also heard from Senator Durbin, King, Klobuchar talking about this as well. They want to go back and also try to put some tweaks on this 19th century law that really came at the heart of the riot last year and also has been coming up recently in the rhetoric of the former president. But when it comes to the Democrats, Joe, not being able to push through the voting rights they really dream of, the Bloomberg editorial piece from our editors at Bloomberg Opinion, I think, get to the heart of it. They quote Otto von Bismarck saying, "Politics is the art of the possible, the attainable, the art of the next best." Potentially for the Democrats, this is something that they can at least do, firm up that the vice president is just ceremonial, but also the fact that just not one lawmaker could raise their hand and say, we want to go against what these states are certifying. You'd have to have more than just one lawmaker to push this through. So potentially a tweak on this is something, then they can go to the midterms and say, we got something a little bit more clarified, but we want to go back to the Hill next year and make sure we can get more of those voting rights measures pushed through. Well,
that's something, Emily. The op-ed that Annmarie mentions, the headline, "Fix the Electoral Count Act Before It's Too Late," reminding us, well, Democrats and Republicans don't agree on much. This could be something that they could do in a bipartisan forum, if only to make an impression. Is this going to happen?
So at this point, I mean, bipartisanship is really the name of the game here. If you're seeing this group working together, that's how the start of the infrastructure bill got through. So that definitely speaks to the potential here. I think a lot of it comes from the Democratic will. Democratic leaders, they had that big voting rights bill. That's the one they wanted to pass. That's the one they feel they still need before the November elections. I mean, yes, this legislation, it deals with updates that lawmakers say are very much needed to the Electoral Count Act, but it doesn't get at things that actually involve American people going to the ballot box, being registered, getting to do mail-in ballots, things of that nature. And that's what Democrats are really concerned about when it comes to this November, that some of the turnout that they saw in 2020 that really helped push them over the top in a number of states, that they're not going to see that again.
Emily, thank you. Annmarie, thank you. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. Hour 2, we'll talk to Dr. Zeke Emanuel, the latest on COVID policy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.